Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight, we're leaving behind the dusty trails of the American frontier and setting sail across the vast Atlantic Ocean, where one of history's greatest maritime mysteries quietly unfolded. Imagine an endless expanse of blue stretching in every direction, the gentle creak of wooden timbers beneath your feet, canvas sails billowing in a cool November breeze, and the rhythmic sound of waves softly brushing against the hull of a merchant brigantine making its way toward Europe. The year is 1872. Steamships have begun to transform global travel, yet thousands of sailing vessels still cross the oceans every year, carrying cargo, families, and dreams between continents. Every voyage demands patience, careful navigation, and an unwavering trust in the sea. Most ships complete their journeys without ever becoming part of history, but one vessel would become different. Not because of a great battle, not because of a terrible storm, and not because anyone ever found its wreck resting on the ocean floor. Instead, the Mary Celeste would become famous for something much quieter. One ordinary day, she was simply found drifting alone. Her sails were still raised. Her cargo remained almost entirely untouched. Food sat in the galley. The crew's belongings were still neatly stored. The captain's instruments were mostly in place. Yet every single person aboard had vanished. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their little daughter Sophia, and the 7 experienced sailors who had sailed with them across the Atlantic. No bodies, no clear signs of violence, no convincing explanation. For more than 150 years, historians, sailors, investigators, writers, and curious minds have tried to answer the same question. What happened aboard the Mary Celeste? Tonight, we won't chase sensational theories or frightening tales. Instead, we'll gently retrace the voyage as carefully as the surviving evidence allows. We'll meet the people aboard, understand the world they lived in, experience daily life on a 19th century sailing ship, and slowly uncover why this quiet merchant vessel became perhaps the most famous ghost ship in history. Because sometimes, the greatest mysteries aren't built from monsters or myths. They're built from ordinary people, living ordinary lives, until something extraordinary happens. Before we begin our voyage together, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy relaxing history documentaries like this one, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, and subscribe to Whispered History if you haven't already. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps this channel continue creating long-form, peaceful history documentaries that thousands of listeners enjoy while relaxing, studying, or falling asleep. Now, dim the lights if you can. Settle comfortably beneath a warm blanket. Take one slow, easy breath, and let the sounds of the sea carry you gently into history. Long before airplanes crossed oceans in a matter of hours, and before giant steel container ships connected every corner of the globe, the Atlantic Ocean belonged largely to sail. In the 19th century, the world's economy floated upon wooden hulls. Cotton from the American South, tea from China, coffee from Brazil, coal from Britain, timber from Canada, wine from Portugal, and thousands of other valuable goods crossed oceans aboard graceful sailing vessels, whose captains relied upon little more than charts, experience, and the stars above. Every voyage demanded remarkable patience. Weather determined almost everything. A favorable wind could push a ship forward for hundreds of miles with surprising speed, while a week of calm weather could leave an entire vessel sitting almost perfectly still upon a glassy sea. Captains learned quickly that the ocean rewarded humility. No matter how experienced they became, nature always had the final word. By 1872, steamships had already begun proving themselves as the future of maritime transportation. Unlike sailing ships, they no longer depended entirely upon favorable winds. Schedules became more reliable. Passengers appreciated the shorter crossings. Merchants welcomed faster deliveries. Yet steam technology remained expensive. Coal stations were still limited across many parts of the world, and countless ports lacked the infrastructure needed to support these powerful new vessels. Because of this, sailing ships continued carrying enormous amounts of cargo across international waters. Many of these ships were beautiful examples of practical craftsmanship, built from carefully selected timber, strengthened with iron fittings, and rigged with towering masts supporting acres of canvas sails. A skilled crew could adjust dozens of ropes in perfect coordination, allowing the vessel to harness changing winds almost like a living creature responding to invisible currents. Among these hard-working merchant ships was one whose name would eventually become known around the world. But she wasn't always called the Mary Celeste. Her story began thousands of miles away in Nova Scotia. There, in the small community of Spencer's Island, skilled shipbuilders launched a brigantine in 1861. She was originally named Amazon. At just over 100 feet long, she wasn't especially large by the standards of her day, nor was she particularly unusual. She was built for work, strong enough to carry heavy cargo, compact enough to enter smaller harbors, and swift enough to compete with other merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic. Her early years were anything but extraordinary. Like countless merchant ships, she carried cargo from port to port, facing ordinary storms, routine repairs, changing owners, and the constant wear that came from battling wind and salt water year after year. Still, some people later looked back upon her earliest voyages and noticed an unusual number of accidents. Her first captain became ill. Minor collisions occurred. Storm damage required repairs. Ownership changed several times. None of these events were especially rare within the dangerous world of 19th century sailing. But after her later disappearance became famous, many people began weaving these unrelated incidents into stories suggesting the vessel had somehow been cursed from the beginning. Historians today view those claims with understandable caution. Ships experienced accidents, captains became sick, storms damaged vessels every season. There was nothing supernatural about such events. After changing hands several times, the ship eventually underwent extensive repairs and rebuilding. She received a new name, Mary Celeste. Fresh paint covered weathered planks. New equipment improved her condition. Her owners hoped she would enjoy many more profitable years transporting cargo between North America and Europe. By late 1872, she appeared ready for another routine voyage. No one standing upon the docks of New York Harbor could have guessed they were looking at a ship destined to become one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. To them, she was simply another merchant vessel preparing for another Atlantic crossing. Workers loaded barrels into her cargo hold. Supplies filled the galley. Fresh drinking water was carefully stored. Charts lay neatly folded inside the captain's cabin. Ropes were inspected, sails examined. Every detail followed the familiar rhythm repeated thousands of times by sailors around the world. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing appeared ominous. The voyage ahead promised hard work, certainly. Perhaps rough weather, almost certainly. But nothing beyond the ordinary expectations of life at sea, or so everyone believed. In our next chapter, we'll meet Captain Benjamin Briggs, his family, and the crew who stepped aboard the Mary Celeste, each carrying their own hopes, ambitions, and quiet expectations, completely unaware that together they were about to become part of one of history's most enduring maritime mysteries. As dawn slowly spread across New York Harbor in the autumn of 1872, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs stood quietly upon the deck of the Mary Celeste, watching the first light shimmer across the calm water. Around him, the harbor was already beginning another busy day. Steam whistles echoed through the cool morning air. Dock workers shouted instructions as wagons rolled over uneven wooden piers. Fishing boats slipped between larger merchant vessels, and gulls circled overhead, hoping to find an easy breakfast wherever sailors happened to leave scraps behind. For Captain Briggs, these familiar sights were comforting. He had spent much of his life surrounded by ships. The sea was not simply his occupation, it was his home. Benjamin Briggs had been born into a family whose history was deeply connected to the ocean. Like many families living along the New England coast, generations before him had earned their living from maritime trade. Fathers taught sons how to read the wind, how to understand tides, and how to navigate by stars long before formal schools offered such lessons. By the age when many children were still learning arithmetic, Benjamin already understood the names of sails, ropes, and distant ports. As he grew older, he earned a reputation that fellow captains respected greatly. He was careful rather than reckless, patient rather than impulsive. He rarely took unnecessary risks simply to save a few days at sea. Those who knew him often described him as deeply religious, thoughtful, and remarkably dependable. In an occupation where lives depended upon sound judgment, those qualities mattered more than boldness. Captains carried enormous responsibility. Every decision they made could affect not only valuable cargo, but also the safety of every soul aboard. Choosing when to leave port, adjusting course during uncertain weather, managing supplies, resolving disagreements among crew members, even deciding how much sail should remain raised during strengthening winds. Each decision rested upon the captain alone. Benjamin Briggs accepted those responsibilities with quiet confidence. Unlike many merchant captains, this voyage would not be a lonely one. Traveling beside him was his wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs. Sarah was only a few years younger than Benjamin, and together they had built a warm family centered around faith, education, and mutual respect. In many ways, she was unusual for the era. Ocean voyages remained uncomfortable and unpredictable, especially for women and children. Cabins were small. Fresh food gradually disappeared as weeks passed. Storms could toss even experienced sailors from their beds. Yet Sarah had accompanied her husband before and understood many realities of life aboard a sailing vessel. She knew the constant rhythm of the sea. She understood that privacy scarcely existed. She accepted the endless creaking of timbers, the smell of salt air, and the gentle rolling motion that never truly stopped. Traveling with them was their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda Briggs. It is perhaps Sophia who touches modern hearts most deeply. One can almost imagine her tiny footsteps echoing across polished wooden floors below deck, her curious eyes watching sailors climb impossibly high into the rigging, her laughter drifting across calm afternoon waters while gulls circled overhead. Historical records suggest she was a healthy, cheerful child. Her parents clearly adored her. On long voyages, she likely became something of a favorite among the crew. Merchant sailors often spent months away from their own families. The cheerful presence of a young child may have reminded them of sons and daughters waiting at home. Benjamin and Sarah also left behind another child. Their 7-year-old son, Arthur, remained with relatives so he could continue attending school. It was a difficult decision. Ocean crossings were lengthy and uncertain. Parents often believed older children benefited more from stability ashore than from months spent aboard crowded merchant vessels. No one imagined that young Arthur would never again see either of his parents or his little sister. Joining the Briggs family were 7 experienced crew members. Unlike dramatic stories that portray mysterious strangers, These men appear to have been ordinary professional sailors. Each brought valuable skills necessary for operating a merchant brigantine across thousands of miles of open ocean. There was First Mate Albert Richardson, Second Mate Andrew Gilling, Steward Edward Head, along with several capable seamen whose daily work kept every aspect of the vessel functioning smoothly. Most merchant sailors lived remarkably disciplined lives while at sea. Romantic novels often described constant adventure, but reality usually involved routine. Each day followed watches lasting several hours. One group remained on duty while another rested. The cycle continued day and night without interruption. Someone always needed to steer. Someone always watched the horizon. Someone inspected sails. Someone checked pumps. Someone prepared meals. Someone cleaned the decks. Life aboard depended entirely upon teamwork. Unlike modern ships equipped with engines, radar, and electronic navigation, a sailing vessel demanded constant physical effort. Even changing direction required coordinated labor. Several sailors might haul together upon thick ropes, while others climbed the rigging dozens of feet above the deck. Every movement required timing, strength, and experience. Trust became essential. Each sailor depended upon every other. The Mary Celeste herself reflected years of careful craftsmanship. She measured just over 100 feet in length and displaced roughly 280 tons. Though modest by today's standards, she represented a reliable cargo vessel capable of crossing entire oceans carrying valuable freight. Below deck lay her cargo hold. Above rested the living quarters. The captain's cabin offered slightly more comfort than the others, though comfort remained a relative term. Wooden furniture was built directly into the walls. Storage space was limited. Every object needed securing before rough weather arrived. Lanterns provided light after sunset. Fresh air entered through small openings whenever conditions allowed. Outside, towering masts carried an impressive network of spars, rigging, and canvas. To newcomers, the countless ropes appeared hopelessly confusing. Experienced sailors, however, knew each one by name. They could identify individual lines even during darkness simply by touch. Preparing for an Atlantic voyage involved much more than loading cargo. Fresh water had to be carefully stored in barrels. Salted meat, flour, beans, rice, coffee, tea, molasses, and preserved vegetables filled storage compartments. Firewood for cooking occupied valuable space. Medical supplies were inspected, charts updated, navigation instruments carefully examined. Even spare sails and replacement rope required consideration. Once at sea, there would be no convenient harbor for forgotten supplies. The cargo selected for this particular voyage consisted largely of industrial alcohol packed securely inside more than 1,700 barrels. This alcohol was intended for commercial use in Italy. Because it was highly concentrated, careful handling remained important throughout the journey. The barrels themselves occupied much of the cargo hold, stacked methodically to prevent shifting as waves rolled beneath the ship. To modern listeners, transporting such cargo may sound unusual, yet merchant vessels routinely carried products that today's world would consider hazardous. Coal, chemicals, whale oil, timber, and other materials traveled regularly across international waters. Experienced captains understood the risks and followed practices developed over generations. As departure approached, final visitors stepped ashore. Last-minute letters exchanged hands. Friends offered farewells. Dock workers untied heavy mooring lines. Nearby captains wished each other favorable winds. Few imagined these ordinary moments would later become subjects of historical fascination. Every face aboard the Mary Celeste belonged to a real person with plans extending beyond the voyage. Perhaps one sailor dreamed of purchasing a small home after several successful trips. Another may have hoped to support aging parents. Captain Briggs likely anticipated returning safely to Arthur with stories for his curious son. Sarah may already have imagined Christmas waiting at journey's end. The sea often encourages such hopeful thoughts. Standing upon a quiet deck, watching land slowly disappear beyond the horizon, one naturally thinks about the future. The Mary Celeste finally eased away from New York Harbor with little ceremony. Her sails gradually filled. The harbor grew smaller behind her. The skyline softened beneath autumn haze. Ahead stretched nearly 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean. The voyage appeared entirely routine. The weather seemed favorable. The crew were experienced. The captain enjoyed an excellent reputation. Nothing suggested that this ordinary departure would soon become one of the most carefully examined voyages in maritime history. As the American coastline slowly faded into the distance, daily life aboard the Mary Celeste settled into its familiar rhythm, and for a time, everything seemed exactly as it should be. The first few days at sea often brought a welcome sense of relief. Behind the Mary Celeste, New York Harbor had disappeared beyond the horizon, along with its crowded docks, noisy warehouses, and constant movement. Ahead lay only the open Atlantic, vast, quiet, and seemingly endless. For Captain Benjamin Briggs and his crew, this was where routine truly began. Life aboard a sailing ship rarely resembled the exciting adventures described in novels. Most days passed peacefully, filled with small tasks repeated hour after hour. It was a world governed by discipline, patience, and steady rhythms, rather than sudden excitement. Each morning began well before sunrise, long before the first hint of daylight reached the eastern horizon. Members of the night watch quietly continued their duties. One sailor stood firmly at the wheel, making tiny corrections as the ship responded to shifting winds. Another carefully scanned the darkness ahead. Although collisions in the middle of the Atlantic were uncommon, they remained possible. Other merchant ships, fishing vessels, drifting wreckage, or unexpected weather could appear with surprisingly little warning. Above them, the sails whispered softly. The ropes gently tightened and relaxed with every passing breeze. The wooden hull creaked almost constantly, as though the ship itself breathed with the motion of the sea. To newcomers, those sounds could seem unsettling. To experienced sailors, they became comforting. Silence often meant there was no wind, and no wind meant no progress. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, the crew changed watches. Fresh faces emerged from below deck, while tired sailors disappeared into the cramped sleeping quarters for a few hours of well-earned rest. The rhythm never stopped. Every 4 hours, another watch began. Every 4 hours, another ended. It continued day after day, week after week, regardless of weather, holidays, or fatigue. Captain Briggs usually rose early. Before making important decisions, he often spent quiet moments observing the sky. Clouds could reveal subtle changes long before the weather itself arrived. The direction of the wind, the appearance of distant swells, the color of sunrise, all offered valuable clues to an experienced mariner. Modern weather forecasts did not exist. The captain's own judgment remained his greatest tool. Once satisfied with conditions, Briggs recorded observations inside the ship's logbook. Each day's position was estimated through careful navigation. Latitude could often be determined by measuring the angle of the sun at noon or the height of familiar stars during the night. Longitude remained more difficult. Captains relied upon carefully regulated chronometers, mathematical calculations, and years of experience. Despite every effort, small errors accumulated. Finding one's position upon an endless ocean demanded remarkable skill. Meanwhile, breakfast slowly came together below deck. The ship's cook faced challenges modern kitchens rarely experience. Fresh ingredients disappeared quickly during long voyages. Instead, meals depended largely upon preserved foods: salted beef, hard biscuits, beans, oatmeal, rice, dried peas, coffee, tea, molasses. Occasionally, if weather permitted, fresh bread could be baked. Simple meals became welcome comforts during weeks at sea. The galley itself occupied only a small space. Cooking over an open flame aboard a wooden sailing vessel required constant caution. Everything had to remain secure. A sudden wave could send boiling pots sliding across the floor if they weren't properly fastened. Even making breakfast demanded experience. After eating, the real work continued. Sails required constant attention. Although they might appear motionless from a distance, canvas stretched, loosened, and shifted continuously as winds changed. Crew members climbed the rigging almost effortlessly, balancing high above the deck with astonishing confidence. Looking upward from below, one might wonder how anyone could move so calmly at such dizzying heights. For sailors, it became second nature. Many had begun climbing rigging as teenagers, some even younger. The sea rewarded practice. Every rope served a purpose. Every knot mattered. Poorly maintained equipment could quickly become dangerous during storms. As a result, inspections never truly ended. Decks also demanded continual care. Salt water slowly damaged wood. Rain collected wherever drainage became blocked. Loose equipment presented hazards. Every morning, someone swept the decks. Someone inspected the pumps. Someone checked cargo hatches. Someone examined the lifeboat. Routine prevented larger problems later. Below deck, Sarah Briggs settled into her own daily rhythm. Although far removed from the duties performed by sailors, life aboard still required organization. The family's small cabin needed constant tidying. Clothing had to remain dry despite damp sea air. Meals with little Sophia became opportunities for normal family life within extraordinary surroundings. Sophia herself likely found endless fascination aboard the ship. Children often discover wonder where adults see routine. Perhaps she watched sunlight sparkle across gentle waves. Perhaps she laughed whenever dolphins briefly appeared alongside the hull. Maybe she collected tiny shells found during earlier travels, or listened carefully as sailors shared stories from distant ports around the world. One can easily imagine crew members smiling whenever the little girl appeared on deck. Merchant sailors spent months separated from their own families. A cheerful child's presence brought warmth to an otherwise hard-working environment. Of course, Captain Briggs never allowed comfort to replace discipline. Even with family aboard, safety remained his highest priority. Sophia would have been carefully supervised whenever she approached the open deck. The Atlantic possessed remarkable beauty, but also enormous power. Throughout the voyage, Captain Briggs regularly inspected the cargo. Nearly 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol rested securely below deck. Each barrel had been carefully packed before departure. Still, heavy seas sometimes cause cargo to shift. If barrels rolled unexpectedly, they could damage the ship's structure or alter its balance. Everything depended upon remaining properly secured. The crew also monitored water inside the bilge. A small amount always collected naturally. No wooden sailing ship remained perfectly dry. Pumps removed excess water each day. Finding a little water was entirely normal. Finding too much could signal serious trouble. Fortunately, during those first days, everything appeared reassuringly ordinary. Weather remained generally favorable. The Mary Celeste moved steadily eastward. The sails remained full. The crew performed well. Captain Briggs had every reason to believe they would reach Genoa without unusual difficulty. Afternoons often became quieter. When duties allowed, sailors repaired clothing, mended ropes, polished equipment, or simply sat together sharing conversation. Stories passed easily among men who had visited ports across the globe. One sailor might describe Liverpool, another remembered Havana. Someone else recalled icy crossings near Newfoundland. Each voyage added another chapter to a lifetime spent following the wind. As evening approached, the Atlantic transformed once again. The sea reflected golden sunlight stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Flying fish occasionally skipped across the surface. Seabirds gradually disappeared as darkness approached. Above, stars slowly emerged in astonishing numbers. Far from city lights, the night sky revealed extraordinary detail. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a glowing river. Constellations guided navigation just as they had for countless generations of mariners. Few experiences match standing quietly upon a wooden deck beneath such a sky. One understood both the vastness of the universe and the remarkable courage required to cross its oceans. Night watches resumed. Lanterns cast warm pools of light across polished wood. Voices grew quieter. The steady splash of waves against the hull became the soundtrack of another peaceful evening at sea. Day after day, the Mary Celeste continued her journey exactly as expected. Nothing unusual disturbed the calm routine. Nothing hinted that history would remember this voyage differently from thousands of others crossing the Atlantic that same year. Yet somewhere beyond the distant horizon, the weather was beginning to change. Autumn in the North Atlantic possessed a personality entirely its own. Gentle breezes could strengthen with astonishing speed. Clear skies could disappear behind towering clouds before nightfall. Experienced sailors understood that calm conditions never lasted forever, and before long, Captain Briggs and his crew would discover once again why generations of mariners respected the Atlantic with equal measures of admiration and caution. Several days had now passed since the Mary Celeste slipped quietly out of New York Harbor. The familiar coastline of North America had long since vanished beyond the western horizon, leaving nothing but open ocean in every direction. For those aboard, this endless expanse no longer felt unusual. It had become home. The sea has a remarkable way of changing a person's sense of distance. On land, a traveler might measure progress by towns, rivers, or mountains. At sea, there are no roads, no signposts, no familiar landmarks, only the slow passage of time, the changing wind, and the careful calculations recorded inside the captain's logbook. Each sunrise looked both familiar and entirely new. Every morning painted the horizon with slightly different shades of gold, orange, and pale blue. Some days, the ocean appeared almost perfectly smooth, reflecting the sky like polished glass. Other mornings revealed long, rolling swells that gently lifted the ship before lowering her once again, as though the Atlantic itself breathed beneath the hull. Captain Benjamin Briggs welcomed these peaceful days. A calm voyage allowed him to devote attention to the countless small responsibilities that filled a captain's schedule. Every afternoon he reviewed navigation calculations with careful precision. His charts lay spread across the small table inside his cabin. Beside them rested a chronometer, one of the most valuable instruments aboard. Unlike an ordinary pocket watch, the marine chronometer was built to keep remarkably accurate time despite the constant motion of a ship. Combined with observations of the sun and stars, it allowed experienced navigators to estimate their longitude with increasing confidence. Even so, navigation remained an art as much as a science. Cloudy skies could prevent celestial observations for days. Strong currents sometimes carried ships farther than expected. Wind rarely blew with perfect consistency. A captain constantly balanced mathematics with practical experience. Benjamin Briggs possessed plenty of both. Those who knew him often remarked upon his careful habits. He rarely rushed important decisions. He preferred steady progress over unnecessary speed. Such caution earned respect throughout the merchant marine. After all, cargo could be replaced, ships could sometimes be repaired, lives could not. While the captain worked with his charts, the crew continued their familiar routines above deck. The sails demanded nearly constant adjustment. Although land dwellers often imagine wind blowing steadily in one direction, reality proved far more complicated. A slight shift in breeze could reduce a ship's speed considerably. Experienced sailors noticed these changes almost instinctively. Without waiting for orders, they loosened one line, tightened another, trimmed the canvas, and gradually returned the Mary Celeste to her most efficient course. Watching skilled sailors work together resembled observing an orchestra. Each person understood precisely when to act. Commands remained surprisingly brief. There was little need for lengthy conversation. Everyone already knew the routine. The vessel responded almost gracefully. As sails adjusted overhead, the brigantine leaned slightly before settling into her new heading. It was teamwork refined through countless voyages. Life below deck followed an equally steady rhythm. Sarah Briggs spent much of her time caring for young Sophia, while also helping create a sense of normal family life aboard the ship. One can imagine quiet afternoons where mother and daughter sat beside the cabin window as sunlight flickered across the moving sea outside. Perhaps Sarah read aloud from a favorite book. Perhaps she sang familiar hymns learned back home in Massachusetts. Perhaps little Sophia simply watched the dancing reflections of light upon the cabin walls while listening to the distant footsteps of sailors crossing the deck overhead. Small routines mattered, especially aboard a ship far from land. Meals also provided moments of welcome familiarity. Breakfast had long passed. Now the cook prepared a simple midday meal. Perhaps salted pork accompanied beans or rice. Fresh vegetables had become increasingly scarce. Only carefully preserved foods remained dependable during long voyages. Water required equal attention. Every barrel represented precious survival. Unlike today, sailors could not simply produce fresh drinking water from the sea. Each gallon loaded in New York had to last until Europe. Careful management remained essential. Coffee often became the preferred morning drink, while tea offered comfort during quieter evenings. Even these simple pleasures reminded everyone of home. Not every hour involved work. When duties allowed, sailors occasionally found moments to rest. Some repaired worn clothing using needle and thread. Others carved small wooden keepsakes. A few quietly smoked pipes while sitting together near the bow, exchanging stories gathered over years spent crossing oceans. Merchant sailors carried remarkable memories. Many had visited dozens of ports scattered across several continents: Liverpool, Lisbon, Kingston, Havana, Marseille. Their conversations became collections of distant places connected only by sea routes few people ashore would ever experience. Captain Briggs sometimes joined these conversations briefly. Although discipline remained important, mutual respect between captain and crew contributed greatly to successful voyages. Historical accounts suggest Briggs treated his men fairly. Fair treatment often inspired greater loyalty than harsh punishment ever could. That loyalty became especially valuable whenever difficult weather arrived. Fortunately, the weather remained generally cooperative. There were occasional squalls, brief periods of stronger wind, and passing showers that washed salt from the decks, but nothing appeared particularly alarming. The Atlantic in late autumn rarely stayed completely calm. Minor weather changes formed part of everyday life. The crew accepted them almost without comment. After every rain, however, inspections became especially important. Wet rigging stretched differently than dry rope. Sails absorbed moisture. Deck planks became slippery. Everything required careful attention before the next change in weather arrived. Captain Briggs also continued inspecting the cargo hold. Below the main deck rested more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. The cargo remained tightly packed, yet every captain understood the conditions below deck could change without obvious warning. Temperature fluctuated, humidity increased, wood naturally expanded and contracted. The barrels themselves deserved regular inspection, not because anyone expected disaster, but because prevention remained far easier than solving problems at sea. The crew also measured water inside the bilge. Every wooden vessel leaked slightly. Seawater found tiny paths through seams despite skilled shipbuilding. This was perfectly normal. Pumps removed accumulated water every day. The process became so routine that experienced sailors barely thought about it. Only unusual amounts raised concern. For now, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. As afternoon gradually turned toward evening, another familiar visitor appeared beside the ship, a small group of dolphins. Graceful and playful, they swam effortlessly alongside the bow, occasionally leaping clear above the water before disappearing beneath the waves once again. Even seasoned sailors often paused to watch. Animals at sea provided welcome company during long voyages. Sometimes whales appeared in the distance. Occasionally, seabirds followed the vessel for hours. Nature constantly reminded sailors they were never truly alone upon the ocean. Young Sophia may have delighted in the dolphins more than anyone else aboard. One can almost picture her standing safely beside her parents, pointing excitedly as sleek gray bodies danced through the surf. Moments like these transformed ordinary voyages into treasured family memories. As darkness slowly settled once again across the Atlantic, another beautiful evening unfolded. The western sky glowed deep orange before fading into soft purple. One by one, the first stars emerged. Captain Briggs stepped onto the deck carrying his sextant. Clear skies offered an excellent opportunity to confirm the ship's position. With practiced movements, he measured the altitude of familiar stars above the horizon. Each observation added another piece to the invisible map, guiding the Mary Celeste steadily toward Europe. Nearby, the helmsman maintained a steady course. Lanterns illuminated only small portions of the deck. Beyond their gentle glow stretched endless darkness. Far overhead, countless stars reflected upon the ocean's surface until sky and sea seemed almost impossible to separate. It was peaceful, beautiful, almost timeless. Yet nature possesses a quiet habit of changing when least expected. Far to the east, beyond the reach of even the sharpest telescope, atmospheric pressure was beginning to fall. Powerful weather systems wandered constantly across the North Atlantic during late November. Most passed without serious consequence. Others reminded every sailor why generations before them had both respected and feared the sea. Within a few days, Captain Briggs and the crew of the Mary Celeste would encounter conditions demanding every bit of their experience, and every decision made during those uncertain hours would later become the subject of endless discussion among historians, searching for answers that the Atlantic has never fully surrendered. By the final week of November 1872, the Mary Celeste had settled completely into the quiet rhythm of life at sea. Days blended gently into one another. The sunrise marked the beginning of another watch. The noon sun helped determine the ship's position. The evening stars guided the vessel through another peaceful night. To someone living ashore, such routine might sound repetitive. To a sailor, routine meant safety. Predictability meant confidence. Every ordinary day that passed without incident carried the ship one step closer to her destination. Yet the Atlantic Ocean had always possessed two very different personalities. There was the calm ocean, the one that reflected brilliant blue skies and carried ships steadily across gentle swells. And then there was the other Atlantic, the one capable of changing almost without warning. Experienced captains never forgot that second face. Benjamin Briggs certainly hadn't. Although the weather remained generally favorable, subtle signs had begun to appear. The breeze no longer held the same steady direction. Clouds gathered more frequently along the horizon. The long rolling swells beneath the ship gradually became more pronounced, arriving from slightly different directions than before. None of these changes caused immediate concern. Every seasoned mariner expected such variations during an autumn crossing. Still, Captain Briggs noticed them. He always did. Several times each day he stepped quietly onto the quarterdeck, studying the horizon with patient attention. He watched the movement of clouds. He observed the color of the sea. He noted how the wind felt against his face. Weather forecasting in the 19th century depended almost entirely upon careful observation. A captain learned to recognize countless subtle clues: the shape of distant clouds, the sudden silence of seabirds, an unexpected swell arriving long before stronger winds, the appearance of a reddish sunrise. Each might reveal something about tomorrow, or perhaps nothing at all. Experience taught sailors never to ignore even the smallest detail. The crew also sensed that conditions were becoming livelier. Adjusting sails became more frequent. The Mary Celeste leaned farther as stronger gusts filled her canvas. Rigging hummed softly overhead, producing low musical tones whenever the wind passed through the tightly stretched ropes. To an experienced sailor, that sound became strangely familiar, almost comforting. It reminded them the ship remained alive and moving. One afternoon, a passing squall arrived with remarkable speed. Only minutes earlier, sunlight had sparkled across the waves. Then, dark clouds swept across the sky. Rain began falling heavily. The wind freshened noticeably. Captain Briggs issued calm, practiced commands. "Sail down." Within moments, crew members climbed into the rigging. Their movements remained confident despite the growing motion beneath their feet. High above the deck, they carefully gathered portions of the great canvas sails, reducing the amount of wind the ship carried. The entire operation lasted only a short time. Soon, the Mary Celeste rode the stronger breeze comfortably, no longer straining against excessive sail. Below deck, Sarah Briggs gathered Sophia close as rain drummed steadily upon the deck overhead. Inside their small cabin, the sounds of the storm seemed louder than they truly were. Every raindrop echoed against the wooden planks. The hull groaned gently as waves lifted the ship higher than before. Furniture creaked. Lanterns swung slightly from their hooks. For a young child, it may have seemed both exciting and unfamiliar, yet Sarah likely remained calm. She had traveled by sea before. She understood that temporary squalls formed a part of everyday life aboard a sailing vessel. Sure enough, within an hour, the rain moved eastward. Sunlight gradually returned. The crew shook water from their jackets and resumed ordinary duties. The Atlantic once again appeared peaceful. Moments like these reminded everyone aboard that weather could change quickly. But not every storm brought danger. Captain Briggs carefully recorded the day's conditions in his logbook. Every captain maintained detailed records: wind direction, weather, estimated position, speed, course, important observations. These entries served practical purposes while also creating an official record of the voyage. Today, those surviving logbooks offer historians priceless glimpses into daily life at sea. Unfortunately, only a portion of the Mary Celeste's log would survive. Much of the voyage would later remain hidden behind unanswered questions. As November drew toward its end, temperatures gradually cooled. The farther east the ship traveled, the fresher the air became. Morning dew appeared more often upon the deck. Crew members reached for heavier jackets before beginning the first watch. The sea itself seemed darker beneath overcast skies. Even so, morale appears to have remained good. There is no reliable evidence suggesting disagreements among the crew. No reports of illness, no indication of panic. Everything historians know points toward an orderly, professionally managed voyage. The cargo remained secure, food supplies remained plentiful, fresh water still appeared sufficient. The Mary Celeste herself continued performing well. Each afternoon the crew inspected the rigging. Salt crystals accumulated constantly wherever seawater dried upon ropes or pulleys. Metal fittings required occasional oiling. Wooden blocks had to turn freely. A single damaged rope might create serious difficulties during stronger weather. Maintenance never truly ended aboard a sailing ship. Even the smallest repair completed today could prevent major trouble tomorrow. Below deck, another quiet inspection took place. The cargo hold, more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, rested exactly where they had been loaded in New York. Most remained perfectly sound. Yet historians now know something Captain Briggs could not fully appreciate at the time. A small number of those barrels had been constructed differently from the others. Instead of sturdy white oak, they had been made from a more porous variety known as red oak. Although perfectly acceptable for many purposes, red oak allowed tiny amounts of vapor to escape far more easily. No one aboard necessarily noticed anything unusual. Industrial alcohol evaporates rapidly. Invisible fumes could gradually collect inside enclosed spaces before slowly dispersing again. Whether this played any role in later events remains uncertain. Modern researchers continue debating the question. Captain Briggs himself almost certainly regarded the cargo as stable. Nothing in his surviving records suggests immediate concern. Life continued. One evening, after another successful day at sea, the Atlantic became unusually calm. The stronger winds faded. The ocean settled into long, gentle swells. Above, the stars appeared with astonishing clarity. Captain Briggs once again carried his sextant onto the deck. Nearby, the helmsman maintained a steady course while another sailor quietly adjusted the compass lantern. Sophia had already fallen asleep below deck. Sarah perhaps spent a few peaceful moments reading by lantern light before retiring for the evening. Elsewhere aboard, off-duty sailors rested in their bunks, grateful for calmer conditions after several days of changing weather. There is something timeless about such nights. The only sounds came from water brushing softly against the hull, the occasional flutter of canvas overhead, and the quiet footsteps of the watch, crossing worn wooden planks. No engines, no electric lights, no distant aircraft crossing the sky. Only wind, stars, and an endless ocean stretching beyond imagination. It is easy from our place in history to wonder whether anyone aboard sensed that something unusual lay ahead. Perhaps Captain Briggs paused longer than usual while studying the horizon. Perhaps Sarah looked out the cabin window before extinguishing the lantern. Perhaps one sailor noticed an unfamiliar smell drifting briefly upward from below deck. Or perhaps nothing at all seemed out of place. History often tempts us to search for warning signs that only become visible after events unfold. Yet real life rarely works that way. Most extraordinary stories begin during entirely ordinary days. The people living them have no idea they are standing at the edge of history. For the Mary Celeste, another sunrise was approaching. Another routine inspection awaited. Another position would be entered into the captain's log. The voyage still appeared steady. The crew remained experienced. The ship continued eastward. But the Atlantic was quietly preparing one final series of tests. And before many more days had passed, the ordinary routine that had carried the Mary Celeste safely across thousands of miles would suddenly come to an end. leaving behind one of the greatest maritime mysteries the world has ever known. As the first days of December approached, the Mary Celeste continued her steady passage eastward across the Atlantic. She had now traveled well over 1,000 miles from New York. Behind her stretched an invisible trail across the open ocean, a route known only through careful calculations recorded inside the captain's logbook. Ahead, Europe still lay many days away. For Captain Benjamin Briggs, this stage of the voyage demanded as much attention as the beginning. Many accidents occurred not because sailors became careless immediately, but because routine slowly encouraged overconfidence. Briggs was determined never to allow that to happen aboard his ship. Every morning began exactly as before. The changing watch quietly exchanged responsibilities. The helmsman reported the night's conditions. The sails were inspected. The pumps were worked. The cargo was checked. Nothing escaped the captain's attention for very long. Yet the Atlantic itself had become increasingly restless. The gentle rolling motion that had accompanied earlier days gradually gave way to larger swells. Not violent, not dangerous, but noticeably different. Instead of lifting the ship in smooth, even rhythms, waves occasionally approached from slightly different directions. The Mary Celeste responded with slow, deliberate movements. She climbed one swell, then gently rolled as another reached her from the side. Experienced sailors adjusted their balance almost without thinking. Years at sea had trained their bodies to move naturally with the ship. Visitors, however, often found such motion exhausting. Walking across the deck required constant awareness. Even carrying a simple bucket of water demanded careful footing. Inside the cabins, every loose object reminded its owner why everything aboard had to be secured. Books shifted, lanterns swung gently, chairs creaked against wooden floors. Small sounds echoed throughout the ship. Still, no one appears to have viewed these conditions as unusual. Autumn crossings regularly brought changing seas. Captain Briggs had experienced far worse during his career. One afternoon, shortly after the midday meal, the crew gathered for another routine inspection of the rigging. The first mate carefully examined several lines near the foremast. Salt, rain, and constant strain slowly weakened natural fibers. Replacing worn rope before failure occurred remained one of the most important responsibilities aboard any sailing vessel. Nearby, another sailor repaired a section of canvas that had begun showing signs of wear. Large sails rarely remain perfect throughout long voyages. Small tears appeared naturally. If ignored, they quickly became larger. A few careful stitches today could prevent losing an entire sail during tomorrow's stronger winds. Maintenance never truly ended. It simply changed from one task to another. Captain Briggs understood this better than anyone. He believed that careful preparation solved countless problems before they ever became emergencies. Perhaps that philosophy explains why so many people respected his leadership. He inspired confidence through quiet competence rather than dramatic displays of authority. Below deck, Sarah continued creating as normal a life as possible for little Sophia. One can easily picture mother and daughter sharing simple games inside their small cabin while the ship rolled gently beneath them. Perhaps Sarah pointed toward a map, showing Sophia where they had departed from and where they hoped soon to arrive. Perhaps she described Italy, its warmer climate, its distant cities, its unfamiliar language. To a 2-year-old, such conversations likely meant little, yet children often remember feelings more than words. Sophia probably remembered the warmth of her mother's voice, the steady motion of the ship, and the reassuring presence of her family. Occasionally, she ventured onto the deck under careful supervision. There she discovered a world unlike anything found on land. Flying fish occasionally burst from the waves before gliding astonishing distances above the water. Seabirds sometimes circled overhead. Clouds drifted endlessly across enormous skies. Every direction offered another horizon. To a small child, the Atlantic must have seemed impossibly large. As evening approached, Captain Briggs once again descended into the cargo hold. He carried a lantern whose warm glow illuminated row after row of tightly packed barrels. The smell below deck differed greatly from the fresh sea air above: wood, tar, rope, and the faint odor naturally associated with industrial alcohol. Everything appeared orderly. The barrels remained secure. Nothing suggested immediate concern. Yet historians today believe subtle changes may already have been taking place. Several of the red oak barrels likely allowed tiny amounts of alcohol vapor to escape. The quantity may have been extremely small, certainly not enough to empty a barrel, but enough that a careful observer might occasionally notice a stronger smell within enclosed spaces. Modern scientific experiments conducted more than a century later suggested an interesting possibility. Alcohol vapor, under certain conditions, could accumulate inside the cargo hold. If concentration increased, even a small spark might produce a sudden flash of pressure, not necessarily an explosion that destroyed the ship, but perhaps a dramatic burst capable of frightening anyone nearby. Whether such an event actually occurred aboard the Mary Celeste remains impossible to prove. There is no surviving witness, no direct evidence, only careful speculation supported by modern research. Captain Briggs himself left no indication that he feared the cargo. His inspections continued calmly. His logbook recorded ordinary observations. Life aboard remained remarkably organized. The weather, however, continued changing. Clouds thickened during the following day. The wind strengthened once again, not enough to threaten the ship, but sufficient to keep every sailor busy. Orders passed quickly across the deck. Ease that line. Take another reef. Secure the hatch. The crew responded with practiced efficiency. Rain returned briefly during the afternoon. Cold droplets swept across the deck before disappearing almost as quickly as they had arrived. The sea darkened beneath the overcast sky. Visibility shortened. Far-off horizons vanished behind gray curtains of mist. For several hours, the Mary Celeste sailed through a world where ocean and sky blended into nearly identical shades of blue-gray. Navigation became more challenging. Without clear views of the sun, Captain Briggs relied increasingly upon dead reckoning. This method combined previous observations with estimated speed, direction, wind, and current. It required considerable experience. Fortunately, experience was something Briggs possessed in abundance. That evening, after conditions improved slightly, he entered another position into the logbook. The ship had made satisfactory progress despite the changing weather. There was every reason to believe she remained on course for Genoa. Below deck, supper brought another welcome pause in the day's work. Simple food, warm drinks, quiet conversation. Perhaps someone shared a humorous memory from an earlier voyage. Perhaps another sailor spoke about family waiting back home. Such conversations filled countless evenings aboard merchant vessels. Months at sea encouraged reflection. The ocean provided endless time for thinking. Night arrived earlier now. Winter approached. Darkness settled quickly across the Atlantic. Lanterns once again illuminated only small portions of the deck. Beyond their gentle circles of light stretched endless black water. Above, clouds occasionally opened just enough to reveal brilliant stars before closing once more. Captain Briggs remained on deck longer than usual, not because he feared immediate danger, but because good captains rarely slept deeply whenever weather remained unsettled. He watched the barometer. He studied the clouds. He listened carefully to the wind moving through the rigging. Everything suggested that stronger conditions might still lie ahead. The Mary Celeste continued onward, her sails carrying her steadily eastward through the gathering darkness. Every soul aboard settled into another ordinary night at sea. No one could know that the final entries in the captain's logbook were drawing near. Within only a short time, the historical record would become strangely silent. From that moment forward, the Atlantic itself would become the only remaining witness to whatever truly happened aboard the Mary Celeste during those final, unknowable hours. On the morning of November 25th, 1872, according to the surviving logbook, Captain Benjamin Briggs recorded what would become one of the most carefully studied entries in maritime history. At the time, it appeared entirely ordinary. There were no desperate messages, no warning that danger had arrived, no hurried notes suggesting panic aboard the ship. Instead, like every entry before it, the captain calmly recorded the Mary Celeste's estimated position, weather, and progress. That simple page would eventually become the final voice from everyone aboard. After it, silence. Historians have spent generations examining those last recorded details. The ship had reached waters not far west of the Azores, a scattered chain of volcanic islands rising from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. For sailors crossing between North America and Europe, the Azores were well known. Their green hills often appeared as a welcome sight after weeks of uninterrupted sea. They reminded travelers that land, fresh water, and safe harbors were no longer impossibly distant. Although the Mary Celeste was not planning to stop there, the islands represented an important point along the voyage. From this part of the Atlantic, many captains carefully reassessed their course before continuing toward the Mediterranean. The weather remained somewhat unsettled. Strong winds had passed through the region during previous days. Heavy seas were not uncommon, yet experienced merchant ships regularly sailed through such conditions. Nothing in the surviving evidence suggests the Mary Celeste suffered catastrophic storm damage. In fact, later examinations would reveal something rather surprising. Her masts remained standing. Most of her sails were still intact. The hull showed no obvious signs of collision. She had not struck rocks. She had not burned. She had not sunk. She continued floating. And yet, for reasons history has never fully explained, the people aboard would soon disappear. Throughout that final documented day, life probably followed the same familiar routine that had governed every day since leaving New York. The crew likely changed watches before sunrise. Breakfast would have been prepared in the small galley. The pumps were almost certainly worked as usual. Captain Briggs probably compared compass readings with his charts while calculating the ship's position. Sarah may have spent the morning caring for little Sophia. The sailors adjusted sails whenever shifting winds demanded attention. Nothing about those ordinary activities suggested they would become their final known routine together. This ordinary quality makes the mystery especially powerful. If the final logbook had described a hurricane, a collision, or widespread illness, the disappearance might seem easier to understand. Instead, everything appears strangely normal. One detail has fascinated researchers for decades. When the Mary Celeste was eventually discovered, approximately 3.5 feet of water remained inside her bilge. To modern listeners, that may sound alarming, but experienced sailors often point out that such an amount, while certainly worth monitoring, was not necessarily enough to threaten a vessel of her size. Wooden ships naturally leaked. Rain entered through countless small openings. Sea spray found its way below deck. Regular pumping kept water under control. Captain Briggs almost certainly expected some accumulation. Still, several historians believe the sounding equipment used to measure bilge water may have given inaccurate readings. If Briggs believed far more water had entered the hull than actually existed, he might have reached very different conclusions about the ship's condition. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence cannot tell us exactly what those measurements showed during the final days. Another small clue comes from the cargo itself. When investigators later inspected the barrels of industrial alcohol, they discovered that several were empty. At first glance, this seemed suspicious. Had someone stolen the contents? Had barrels burst open? Closer examination offered a simpler possibility: the red oak barrels. Those same barrels discussed by modern researchers could naturally leak alcohol vapor over time without releasing large amounts of liquid. Tiny quantities escaped gradually through the porous wood, invisible, almost impossible to detect from outside. Some scientists believe these escaping vapors may have accumulated inside the cargo hold before eventually venting through the hatches. If such vapors ignited briefly, perhaps from friction or another small source, the resulting pressure wave might have been loud enough to frighten everyone aboard while leaving little lasting physical damage. Modern experiments have shown that alcohol vapor can produce dramatic flashes without necessarily burning surrounding wood. Imagine standing upon the deck of a wooden sailing ship. Suddenly, a deep thump echoes upward from below. Perhaps the hatch lifts slightly. A rush of warm air follows. No flames appear. No explosion tears apart the vessel. Yet no captain could immediately know what had happened beneath his feet. Was another larger explosion about to follow? Had the cargo become unstable? Was fire beginning somewhere below deck? Such uncertainty might demand immediate action. Again, no one knows whether anything like this truly occurred. It remains only one carefully considered theory. History offers no eyewitness to confirm or reject it. Meanwhile, the weather around the Azores continued changing. Strong gusts alternated with calmer periods. Heavy swells rolled beneath the ship. Visibility shifted throughout the day as passing showers crossed the ocean. Conditions required constant attention. The crew likely remained busy trimming sails and maintaining course. Captain Briggs had navigated similar weather countless times. There is little reason to believe he suddenly lost confidence in his abilities. Yet every captain understood one simple truth: the sea often forced difficult decisions with incomplete information. Should more sail remain raised or less? Should course change slightly or remain steady? Should cargo be inspected again or left undisturbed? Every choice balanced competing risks. Sometimes there was no perfect answer. As afternoon gradually faded into evening, the Mary Celeste continued moving eastward. Somewhere below deck, lanterns would eventually have been lit. Supper prepared, the next watch assigned. Above, clouds drifted across the fading sky while the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward every horizon. Perhaps Captain Briggs stood alone for a few quiet moments after sunset. Many captains appreciated those peaceful intervals when day's work briefly slowed. The sea possesses a unique silence during twilight. Wind softens, colors fade, the first stars appear one by one. Even today, standing upon an open deck at dusk often inspires quiet reflection. Perhaps Briggs thought about Arthur waiting safely back in Massachusetts. Perhaps Sarah looked forward to arriving in Genoa. Perhaps little Sophia had already fallen asleep inside the family cabin, gently rocked by the motion of the ship. No surviving record tells us. Only imagination bridges those final hours. What happened next, whether during the night or the following morning, remains one of history's greatest unanswered questions. There were no survivors to describe the events. No distress signal reached another vessel. No nearby crew witnessed unusual activity. The Atlantic kept its silence, somewhere between that final ordinary logbook entry and the moment another ship would eventually discover the Mary Celeste. Every person aboard disappeared. Not one remained behind. The captain, his wife, their young daughter, 7 experienced sailors, all vanished together, leaving only an empty ship, still sailing quietly across the Atlantic, as though patiently waiting for someone else to arrive, and ask the same question that has echoed through history ever since. What happened here? For several days, the Atlantic held its secret alone. The Mary Celeste continued across the open ocean with no visible sign that anything extraordinary had occurred aboard. Her sails still caught the wind. Her hull still rode the swells. From a distance, she appeared to be exactly what every passing sailor expected to see: a merchant brigantine quietly making her way toward Europe. No signal flags warned of trouble. No distress cannon echoed across the sea. No smoke marked a fire. Nothing about her outward appearance suggested that every soul aboard had vanished. Meanwhile, nearly 400 miles away, another American merchant vessel continued her own journey. She was the brigantine Dei Gratia. Like the Mary Celeste, she was bound for Europe after departing North America with a commercial cargo. Her captain, David Morehouse, was an experienced mariner who had spent much of his life crossing the Atlantic. Fate had arranged a remarkable coincidence. Captain Morehouse personally knew Benjamin Briggs. The 2 men had crossed paths before in maritime circles and were said to hold one another in high regard, by pure chance. Their ships had departed from New York only a short time apart. Neither man could possibly have imagined that their paths would cross again under such mysterious circumstances. The morning of December 4th, 1872, began much like countless others. The Atlantic rolled beneath the Dei Gratia with long, steady swells. A cool breeze filled her sails. Crew members carried out their regular duties while maintaining a careful lookout, as sailors always did in open waters. Visibility was good. The horizon stretched in every direction beneath a pale winter sky. Around midday, one of the sailors noticed something unusual. A vessel appeared in the distance. At first, there seemed nothing remarkable about it. Ships frequently encountered one another on busy Atlantic trade routes. Still, something about this particular vessel attracted attention. She moved strangely. Instead of maintaining a confident, steady course, she appeared to wander slightly from side to side. Her sails looked unevenly set. Occasionally, the wind caught them awkwardly before they settled once more. Captain Morehouse was informed. Using his spyglass, he studied the distant brigantine. As she gradually drew nearer, he recognized her shape. It appeared to be the Mary Celeste. Recognition soon gave way to curiosity. Captain Morehouse expected certain signals between passing ships. Merchant captains commonly exchanged greetings, identified themselves, or acknowledged one another through flags. The Mary Celeste offered no response. No one appeared upon her deck. This silence felt deeply unusual. Ships crossing the Atlantic represented rare opportunities for communication. Ignoring another vessel without reason simply was not normal. The Dei Gratia altered course slightly to investigate. Hour by hour, the distance between the 2 ships slowly disappeared. As the Mary Celeste came fully into view, concern steadily replaced curiosity. Her sails remained raised, though several hung improperly trimmed. One line trailed loosely. The helm did not appear firmly controlled, yet she remained afloat in remarkably good condition. Captain Morehouse called repeatedly across the water. No answer came back. The only reply was the steady sound of wind passing through canvas. Experienced sailors often develop strong instincts. Something felt profoundly wrong. After careful consideration, Captain Morehouse decided to send a boarding party. It was not a decision made lightly. Approaching another vessel on the open sea always carried risks. Disease, violence, or structural damage could await aboard an apparently abandoned ship. Nevertheless, someone needed to discover why the Mary Celeste sailed without answering. First Mate Oliver DeVoe volunteered to lead the small party. Accompanied by several experienced sailors, he climbed into a small boat and carefully crossed the water separating the two vessels. As they approached, the silence became even more unsettling. No footsteps echoed across the deck. No voices drifted from below. No captain appeared to welcome visitors aboard. The boarding party climbed onto the Mary Celeste, one careful step at a time. The deck beneath their boots felt solid. The ship rolled gently with the sea. Everything appeared strangely ordinary. Then came the realization. No one was there. The wheel stood unattended. The deck was empty. The boarding party called out. No answer. They searched the cabins. Still nothing. Captain Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia, the officers, the crew, every person had vanished. The silence must have felt almost overwhelming. Imagine entering a home where breakfast sits upon the table, where clothing remains folded, where daily life seems ready to continue, yet no one remains. That quiet absence often feels more unsettling than visible destruction. The Mary Celeste offered exactly that feeling. She did not resemble the aftermath of a violent catastrophe. Instead, she appeared interrupted. The captain's cabin still contained personal belongings. Navigation equipment remained, although the ship's sextant and marine chronometer were missing. The logbook had disappeared after its final recorded entry. These missing items suggested that someone had intentionally taken essential navigational instruments. The ship's papers were also gone. That detail would later become highly significant. If everyone had abandoned ship deliberately, those were precisely the items a captain would likely carry. Elsewhere aboard, the boarding party discovered that the cargo remained almost entirely untouched. Hundreds upon hundreds of barrels still rested securely inside the hold. Nothing suggested piracy. Valuable possessions belonging to the captain and crew remained where they had been left. Money had not been stolen. Jewelry remained undisturbed. Supplies filled the storeroom. There was enough food and fresh water to continue the voyage for many more days. The galley showed no sign of frantic departure. Beds had been slept in. Clothing remained inside drawers. Everything suggested that life aboard had continued normally, until suddenly, it had not. The lifeboat, however, was missing. So was a length of rope that appeared to have been attached to it. The empty davits where the boat had once rested immediately caught the attention of the boarding party. If Captain Briggs had ordered everyone into the lifeboat, why? The Mary Celeste herself still floated securely. She had certainly suffered wear from recent weather. Some sails were damaged. Water stood inside the bilge. The pumps presented mechanical concerns. Yet nothing immediately explained abandoning a seaworthy vessel. That contradiction would puzzle investigators for generations. Standing upon the quiet deck, Oliver DeVoe likely understood that he had become part of an extraordinary story. The Atlantic was vast beyond imagination. Ships disappeared from time to time. Storms claimed countless lives. But finding a vessel still sailing, perfectly capable of remaining afloat, entirely deserted, was something almost unheard of. After completing a careful inspection, the boarding party returned to the Dei Gratia with astonishing news. Captain Morehouse listened as every detail was reported. The Mary Celeste had been found. She remained afloat. Her cargo remained aboard, but not a single person could be found. The mystery had only just begun. Before long, the abandoned brigantine would be guided toward Gibraltar by a prize crew. Officials, newspapers, and eventually the entire world would begin asking questions. questions that seemed simple at first. Where had Captain Briggs gone? Why had the crew left? Why abandon a ship that still floated safely upon the sea more than 150 years later? Those same quiet questions continue to drift across the Atlantic, carried perhaps by the same winds that once filled the lonely sails of the Mary Celeste. With the mystery of the abandoned ship now firmly established, the Mary Celeste began the final stage of a voyage unlike any other. A small prize crew from the Dei Gratia took control of the brigantine, carefully preparing her for the journey to Gibraltar. Under maritime law, an abandoned vessel found at sea could be claimed as salvage if safely brought into port. The reward depended upon the value of both the ship and her cargo, as well as the skill and danger involved in recovering them. Captain David Morehouse selected trusted men for the difficult task. First Mate Oliver DeVoe accepted command of the Mary Celeste. Only a handful of sailors accompanied him. Normally, a vessel of her size required a much larger crew. Now, just a few determined men would attempt to sail 2 ships across the remaining miles of the Atlantic. It demanded experience, patience, and no small amount of courage. The weather had not suddenly become calmer simply because the mystery had begun. Winter still approached. The sea continued to rise and fall beneath both vessels. Every sail required attention. Every course correction demanded careful judgment. The prize crew worked almost constantly. With so few hands aboard, every sailor performed several jobs. One man steered, another adjusted sails, a third inspected rigging. Rest came only in brief intervals. Yet despite the limited crew, the Mary Celeste handled surprisingly well. Her hull remained strong. Her mast stood firm. Although several sails required repair, she continued responding faithfully to the wind. Each passing day raised an even more troubling question. If this small salvage crew could safely sail the vessel toward Gibraltar, why had Captain Briggs abandoned her? Oliver DeVoe examined nearly every corner of the ship during the crossing. He searched not only for clues, but also for practical concerns that might threaten his own crew. He found evidence of recent weather. The decks showed signs of hard use. Some rigging had suffered damage. Several sails displayed tiers that needed mending. The compass housing had been disturbed. One of the pumps was partially disassembled. These observations painted the picture of a ship that had encountered difficulties, but not destruction. Below deck, approximately 3.5 feet of water remained in the bilge. Again, this sounded dramatic, yet experienced sailors understood that wooden vessels often carried some water. Whether Captain Briggs believed there was significantly more than actually existed would later become one of the investigation's most important questions. The cargo remained remarkably secure. More than 1,700 barrels still rested within the hold. Only a small number appeared empty. No evidence suggested widespread leakage. No fire had blackened the timbers. No violent explosion had shattered the hull. Everything remained strangely consistent with the first impression. The Mary Celeste had not been destroyed. She had simply been left behind. As the small prize crew continued eastward, conversations inevitably returned to the mystery. The Atlantic provided long hours for quiet reflection. What had frightened an experienced captain? Had weather played a greater role than first imagined? Had some unseen emergency forced everyone into the missing lifeboat? Or had something altogether different occurred? No answer seemed completely satisfying. The more closely sailors examined the ship, the stranger the situation became. Eventually, the towering rock of Gibraltar appeared on the horizon. For generations of mariners, this famous landmark marked the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. After weeks surrounded by nothing but water, the sight of land often inspired relief. Yet for those aboard the Mary Celeste, arrival meant something different. questions, officials, investigations, and careful examination. On December 13, 1872, the abandoned brigantine entered Gibraltar Harbor. Word spread quickly. News traveled rapidly through any port. An abandoned American merchant vessel arriving under the command of another ship immediately attracted widespread attention. Dock workers paused their labor. Local sailors exchanged curious glances. Harbor officials prepared to inspect the unusual arrival. Soon, government representatives boarded the Mary Celeste. Unlike the first boarding party, these investigators viewed everything through a different lens. They were not simply interested in sailing the vessel safely. They wanted explanations. Every damaged rope, every water stain, every missing item, every unusual observation might become an important clue. The official responsible for much of the investigation was Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar. Flood approached the mystery with determination. He believed unusual disappearances rarely resulted from simple explanations. Instead, he suspected hidden crimes, perhaps mutiny, perhaps murder, perhaps fraud. His imagination explored possibilities far beyond ordinary accidents. Initially, Flood questioned Captain Morehouse himself. After all, the Dei Gratia had discovered the abandoned vessel. Could the rescuers somehow have been involved? Had they attacked the Mary Celeste before pretending to discover her? Such accusations required careful examination. Captain Morehouse cooperated fully. So did Oliver DeVoe and the rest of the prize crew. Their accounts remained consistent. The condition of both ships supported their testimony. No evidence suggested violence between the vessels. Still, the investigation continued. Surveyors examined the hull. Carpenters inspected damaged timbers. Divers even looked beneath the waterline. One observation briefly attracted attention. Investigators noticed several marks upon a sword found aboard. At first glance, some wondered whether they might be bloodstains. Scientific testing in the 19th century remained extremely limited. Early conclusions often relied more upon appearance than certainty. Later examinations suggested the stains were likely rust rather than blood. Likewise, certain cuts observed on the ship's railings initially seemed suspicious. Had swords been drawn? Had desperate fighting occurred? Further inspection offered far simpler explanations. Years of ordinary wear, heavy ropes, and constant use could easily leave similar marks. Again, evidence refused to support dramatic conclusions. The cargo also underwent careful inspection. Several barrels had indeed emptied, but investigators gradually recognized that natural leakage offered a reasonable explanation. The barrels themselves varied in construction. Some were made from porous red oak rather than tighter white oak. Tiny amounts of alcohol could escape over long periods without requiring sabotage. Every clue seemed to lead investigators toward uncertainty rather than certainty. Nothing fully supported piracy. Nothing clearly proved mutiny. Nothing confirmed murder. Yet nothing explained voluntary abandonment either. Captain Briggs presented another difficulty for those searching for criminal motives. By every historical account, he enjoyed an excellent reputation. He was respected throughout the merchant marine. His crew also appeared carefully selected. There were no known dangerous criminals aboard, no documented conflicts, no evidence of serious disagreements before departure. Even Sarah and little Sophia had accompanied him. A captain planning anything dishonest would hardly choose to place his own family in danger. The facts resisted simple storytelling. As days passed, officials compiled reports while newspapers eagerly awaited updates. The mystery had already begun escaping the harbor. Soon it would travel across Europe, across America, and eventually around the world. Readers found the story irresistible. An abandoned ship, an experienced captain, A missing family. Cargo left untouched, no survivors, no clear explanation. It possessed every ingredient needed to capture public imagination. Yet within the quiet harbor of Gibraltar, the atmosphere remained far more thoughtful than sensational. Experienced sailors understood something many readers did not. The sea often produced mysteries simply because there were no witnesses. When events unfolded hundreds of miles from land, evidence disappeared quickly. Wind erased tracks. Rain washed away clues. Waves carried away anything floating upon the surface. Sometimes, the ocean answered every question. Other times, it kept them forever. The Mary Celeste had arrived safely in port. Her voyage was finally over. But the journey toward understanding, the journey historians still continue today, had only just begun. As the investigation in Gibraltar continued, another story quietly unfolded. It was no longer only about the people who had disappeared. It was also about the remarkable condition of the ship they had left behind. Every investigator who stepped aboard expected to find decisive evidence, perhaps a shattered mast, perhaps unmistakable signs of fire, perhaps widespread flooding or structural failure. Instead, the Mary Celeste offered only quiet contradictions. She seemed to whisper clues, yet none of them spoke loudly enough to solve the mystery. The first impression remained the same. She was weathered, but she was not ruined. Years spent crossing the Atlantic had naturally marked her timbers. The recent storms had left torn canvas and strained rigging. Sea spray coated the rails with salt. The deck carried the ordinary signs of hard work performed during a long voyage. Nothing about her appearance suggested a ship moments away from sinking. That fact puzzled nearly everyone. Surveyors carefully measured the amount of water inside the hull. Around 3.5 feet remained in the bilge. To someone unfamiliar with 19th century sailing ships, that amount sounds alarming. Yet wooden merchant vessels rarely remained perfectly dry. Seawater slowly entered through seams that expanded and contracted with changing temperatures. Rainwater also found its way below deck. Every captain expected to pump water regularly throughout a voyage. The more important question was whether Captain Briggs believed conditions were becoming dangerous. The Mary Celeste's pump system offered another intriguing clue. One pump had been taken apart. At first glance, this appeared troubling. Had it failed during the rough weather? Had the crew discovered it was no longer working? If so, Captain Briggs may have struggled to determine exactly how much water remained below deck. Some historians believe a malfunctioning pump could have created a frightening misunderstanding. Imagine trying to measure water accumulating beneath the floor of a wooden ship while large waves constantly lifted and rolled the vessel. If the sounding rod suggested rising water, and the pump could not immediately confirm otherwise, a captain might naturally fear the worst. Even an experienced mariner possessed only the information available in that moment. No one aboard could see through the hull. They relied upon instruments, observation, and judgment. Another careful inspection focused upon the cargo. The industrial alcohol remained stacked in orderly rows. Investigators counted barrel after barrel. Most remained tightly sealed. Only 9 were found empty. Although that discovery initially attracted attention, the number proved surprisingly small, considering the size of the shipment. More than 1,700 barrels had crossed weeks of open ocean. The overwhelming majority remained intact. Modern researchers later examined shipping records and barrel construction in remarkable detail. Those empty barrels had largely been built from red oak rather than white oak. Unlike white oak, whose cellular structure naturally resisted liquids, red oak contained tiny open passages that allowed vapors to escape much more easily. The difference mattered. Industrial alcohol evaporates readily. Tiny quantities could slowly disappear through porous wood without leaving dramatic pools of liquid inside the cargo hold. To Captain Briggs, if he noticed an unusually strong smell below deck, the cause may not have been obvious. He certainly understood his cargo, but no captain welcomed unexpected odors associated with highly flammable cargoes. The possibility of accumulating vapor, though invisible, may have remained in the back of his mind. Again, history cannot tell us exactly what he observed. Only that later investigators found evidence consistent with gradual evaporation. Attention also turned toward the ship's food and water supplies. These remained plentiful. Fresh drinking water had not run dangerously low. The galley still contained cooking equipment. There was no sign that starvation or thirst had driven desperate decisions. The crew had every reason to expect reaching Europe successfully if the voyage continued normally. Personal belongings created perhaps the most haunting impression of all. Captain Briggs's clothing remained neatly stored. Sarah's possessions still occupied the family cabin. Small, everyday objects rested exactly where they had last been used. None suggested hurried packing. None reflected panic. Instead, the cabins resembled spaces their occupants fully expected to return to. It is often these ordinary details that make historical mysteries feel most personal. A pair of boots left beside a bed, a folded blanket, a child's belongings quietly waiting inside a cabin. Such objects remind us that history concerns real families rather than simply famous events. The Mary Celeste was not merely a ship. For several weeks, she had been a floating home. Investigators searched carefully for evidence of violence. They found remarkably little. No bullet holes pierced the timbers. No broken furniture suggested desperate fighting. No widespread bloodstains covered the deck. Minor marks certainly existed. After all, every working ship accumulated scratches, dents, and damaged wood through ordinary labor. Heavy ropes rubbed constantly against railings. Cargo shifted slightly during rough seas. Crew members used tools every day. Separating ordinary wear from meaningful evidence proved extremely difficult. The sails also revealed an interesting story. Several had suffered damage during recent weather. A few required repair. Some lines had broken. Yet experienced sailors pointed out that vessels routinely completed voyages with similar wear. Nothing indicated a storm powerful enough to explain abandoning ship. The missing lifeboat remained one of the strongest clues. It had almost certainly been lowered deliberately. The ropes associated with it were gone. This suggested an organized departure rather than a sudden catastrophe. Captains did not simply lose lifeboats accidentally. Someone had prepared it. Someone had boarded it. The question remained, why? The missing navigation instruments strengthened this idea. Captain Briggs had taken the sextant. The marine chronometer had disappeared. The ship's official papers were also missing. These were precisely the items required if a captain believed he intended to continue navigating elsewhere. Perhaps in a lifeboat temporarily connected to the ship. Perhaps toward nearby land. Perhaps while expecting to return. Few historians believe Captain Briggs intended to abandon the Mary Celeste forever. Everything about his character suggests otherwise. He was careful, methodical, deeply devoted to his family. Leaving behind a perfectly serviceable ship without overwhelming reason simply does not fit the portrait drawn by those who knew him. As investigators completed their surveys, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. No single piece of evidence explained the disappearance. Instead, many small clues pointed in different directions. Some hinted at weather. Others suggested concern about the cargo. Still others implied temporary evacuation. Each possibility seemed reasonable by itself, yet none answered every question. That uncertainty frustrated officials, hoping to close the case. People naturally prefer clear endings. History, however, rarely promises them. Sometimes the surviving evidence forms a complete picture. At other times, it resembles a puzzle missing several crucial pieces. The Mary Celeste belonged firmly to the second kind. The ship herself survived. The people did not. The ocean preserved the vessel, while quietly carrying away the final moments of everyone aboard. Generations of historians would continue studying every surviving document, every damaged plank, every weather report, and every barrel inside the cargo hold. With each new investigation came another possible explanation. Some sounded remarkably convincing. Others wandered into pure imagination. Over the decades, the mystery would grow far beyond the quiet reality discovered aboard that lonely brigantine. Facts would become mixed with fiction, rumors would become accepted as truth, and one abandoned merchant ship would slowly transform into one of the world's most enduring maritime legends. Once the Mary Celeste rested safely in Gibraltar Harbor, the mystery passed from the hands of sailors into the hands of lawyers, government officials, and investigators. Their task appeared simple: determine what had happened aboard the abandoned vessel. Yet as each day passed, the answers became no clearer. The official inquiry began in a courtroom rather than upon the sea. Witnesses arrived one by one: captains, crew members, surveyors, shipbuilders, merchants. Each described what they had seen with careful attention to detail. Captain David Morehouse spoke first. He explained how the Dei Gracia had encountered the drifting brigantine on December 4th. He described the unusual movement of the ship, the unanswered signals, the silent deck, the boarding party, the missing crew. His testimony remained calm and consistent. So did the accounts given by First Mate Oliver DeVoe and the sailors who had climbed aboard the Mary Celeste. Although each man noticed slightly different details, their stories agreed on the most important facts. The ship had been deserted. The cargo remained largely untouched. No obvious evidence of violence could be found. Investigators listened carefully. Then they began asking more difficult questions. Could Captain Morehouse somehow have arranged the disappearance himself? At first glance, the idea seemed almost impossible. The two ships had departed New York separately. No witnesses reported suspicious meetings during the voyage. No valuable cargo had disappeared. Yet the possibility had to be considered. Maritime law awarded financial compensation to those who successfully recovered abandoned vessels. The Mary Celeste represented valuable property. Whenever money entered a mystery, officials believed every possibility deserved examination. Captain Morehouse answered patiently. He explained his previous acquaintance with Benjamin Briggs. The two captains respected one another. There had been no known disagreement between them. Their ships had simply happened to cross paths in the middle of the Atlantic. The boarding party supported every part of his account. Gradually, suspicion toward the crew of the Dei Gracia began to weaken. Still, Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood remained unconvinced that the mystery resulted from ordinary events. Flood possessed a sharp legal mind. He had spent years examining difficult cases, yet he also displayed a tendency to search for hidden plots even when evidence remained limited. The disappearance of 10 people seemed too extraordinary for a simple explanation. Surely, he believed, someone must have committed a crime. Flood ordered even more detailed inspections of the Mary Celeste. Surveyors carefully examined every section of the hull. Carpenters measured damaged timbers. Divers inspected the underwater portion of the ship. Experts evaluated the cargo. Every report added information. Very few added certainty. One survey revealed a shallow cut near the bow. Another described marks along portions of the railing. Flood wondered whether these indicated violence. Perhaps swords had been drawn, perhaps desperate fighting had broken out aboard the vessel. Perhaps mutiny had claimed the lives of Captain Briggs and his family. It sounded dramatic, yet experienced shipwrights offered a quieter interpretation. Wooden ships accumulated countless marks through ordinary service. Heavy cargo shifted, anchors rubbed, rigging strained against the rails, tools slipped, storms threw loose equipment across the deck. Small cuts and dents appeared naturally over time. None of the observed damage proved violence. The sword discovered aboard also attracted attention. Investigators noticed reddish stains upon its blade. Some immediately wondered whether they had found traces of blood. Modern forensic science did not yet exist. There were no advanced laboratory tests. Microscopes remained limited. DNA lay decades beyond scientific imagination. Many conclusions depended largely upon appearance alone. Later examinations suggested the stains were almost certainly rust. Once again, a promising clue quietly faded. The cargo created similar disappointment. Officials inspected the barrels repeatedly. Only 9 had emptied. Most remained full. The shipment itself appeared undisturbed. If pirates had boarded the ship, why leave such valuable cargo behind? If mutineers sought profit, why abandon the vessel instead of selling both ship and alcohol? The evidence simply refused to support those theories. Attention returned to Captain Benjamin Briggs himself. Investigators gathered information about his character. Friends described him as thoughtful, responsible, deeply religious, and widely respected. He possessed years of successful experience at sea. There were no reports of reckless behavior, no known financial desperation, no obvious reason to stage an elaborate disappearance. Most importantly, he had chosen to bring Sarah and little Sophia aboard. That decision carried great weight. Captains sometimes traveled alone. Benjamin Briggs had instead surrounded himself with the people he loved most. Such a man seemed unlikely to risk their lives unnecessarily. The crew also came under scrutiny. Officials searched for signs of conflict. Perhaps resentment had grown during the voyage. Perhaps disagreements had turned violent. Historical records, however, revealed little support for that possibility. The sailors appeared experienced. Several had served together before. No documented quarrels emerged before departure. Nothing suggested growing rebellion. Little by little, each dramatic theory lost strength. The inquiry grew longer. Witnesses repeated earlier statements. Experts offered careful opinions. Still no explanation fully satisfied the investigators. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, curiosity spread rapidly. Newspapers eagerly reported every development. Readers across Britain and America followed the case with fascination. Many had never heard of the Mary Celeste before her arrival in Gibraltar. Now, the abandoned brigantine appeared in headlines around the world. Journalists faced the same challenge confronting investigators. Facts alone left many questions unanswered. Where certainty disappeared, speculation often rushed to fill the empty space. Some newspapers suggested mutiny, others hinted at pirates. A few proposed secret conspiracies. These stories captured attention. They also traveled much faster than cautious official reports. The actual investigation moved slowly. Real evidence always requires patience. At last, after months of examination, officials reached an unsatisfying conclusion. They had found no convincing evidence of piracy, no proof of mutiny, no clear signs of murder, no explanation that fully accounted for the disappearance. Without sufficient evidence, no criminal charges could reasonably be brought against Captain Morehouse or anyone connected with the Dei Gratia. The salvage claim eventually proceeded, although the reward proved smaller than many expected. The lingering suspicion surrounding the mystery influenced that decision. Even without proof, questions had complicated the case. Captain Morehouse and his crew had rescued the abandoned ship. Instead of universal praise, they found themselves living beneath a shadow of uncertainty. For Benjamin Briggs and his family, the outcome offered no comfort. No bodies had been recovered. No final message had been found. There would be no funeral attended beside familiar graves, only absence. For those waiting back home, hope may have lingered for a time. The sea occasionally returned missing sailors after many weeks. Perhaps another ship had rescued them. Perhaps they had reached an isolated island. Perhaps some extraordinary explanation still waited beyond the horizon. As weeks became months, those hopes gradually faded. The Atlantic had offered only one thing in return: an empty ship. The official investigation had ended, yet the mystery itself remained very much alive. Indeed, its most remarkable chapter had not yet begun. For while judges and investigators accepted uncertainty, storytellers rarely did. In the years that followed, writers, novelists, and newspaper editors would transform the quiet facts of the Mary Celeste into tales of monsters, ghosts, pirates, sea serpents, and supernatural curses. The real history would slowly become wrapped inside layers of imagination, until separating truth from legend became almost as mysterious as the disappearance itself. Long after the official investigation had ended, the Mary Celeste refused to disappear from public imagination. In many ways, her real voyage was over, but her legendary voyage had only just begun. The unanswered questions surrounding the abandoned brigantine created something both historians and storytellers understand very well. People are naturally uncomfortable with mysteries that have no ending. When facts leave empty spaces, human imagination eagerly fills them. Within only a few years, newspapers began publishing articles that mixed documented history with rumor. Small details gradually changed. Ordinary observations became dramatic discoveries. Simple uncertainty slowly transformed into elaborate stories. Each retelling carried the mystery a little farther from the surviving evidence. One of the earliest and most influential examples appeared in 1884. A young physician and aspiring writer named Arthur Conan Doyle published a short fictional story inspired by the Mary Celeste. Years later, the world would know him as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. At the time, however, he was still building his literary career. His story was titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. Although presented as fiction, many readers believed it described the real disappearance. The ship's name was slightly changed. Characters were invented. Events became far more dramatic. Conan Doyle introduced murder, revenge, secret conspiracies, and extraordinary adventures that had never occurred aboard the actual Mary Celeste. The story became enormously popular. Unfortunately, its popularity created lasting confusion. Many readers remembered the exciting fictional version more clearly than the genuine historical record. Even today, some supposed facts about the Mary Celeste can be traced directly back to that single piece of fiction rather than to official documents. It serves as a gentle reminder that memorable stories often travel farther than careful history. As the decades passed, even more theories emerged. Some suggested pirates. At first glance, piracy seemed like an obvious explanation. After all, the Atlantic had long been associated with tales of sea robbers. Yet the evidence never truly supported this idea. Pirates seeking profit would almost certainly have taken valuable cargo. The industrial alcohol remained aboard. personal belongings remained untouched. Money and valuables had not been systematically stolen. Even the ship herself represented considerable value. Abandoning such prizes made little sense. Others imagined mutiny. Perhaps the crew had rebelled against Captain Briggs. Perhaps disagreements had grown until violence erupted. Again, the historical evidence offered little encouragement. Benjamin Briggs enjoyed an excellent reputation. No surviving records describe serious conflict before departure. The crew consisted largely of experienced merchant sailors rather than unwilling recruits. Mutiny certainly occurred in maritime history, but investigators found no convincing sign of it aboard the Mary Celeste. Another suggestion involved foul weather. This theory possessed greater credibility. The North Atlantic during late autumn could become unpredictable. Powerful squalls appeared quickly. Large waves tested even experienced crews. Perhaps Captain Briggs believed the ship had suffered fatal damage. Perhaps inaccurate soundings convinced him she was filling rapidly with water. If so, ordering everyone into the lifeboat might have seemed the safest temporary decision. Supporters of this theory often imagine the lifeboat remaining attached to the ship by a long rope. Should weather suddenly worsen, the rope might have broken. The unmanned Mary Celeste would continue sailing with the wind. The crowded lifeboat, much lower in the water, could quickly disappear among the waves. It remains one of the more widely discussed possibilities because it requires no mysterious forces, only a series of unfortunate decisions made under difficult circumstances. Then there is the theory involving alcohol vapor. This explanation gained greater attention during the late 20th century, after scientists and maritime historians carefully studied the cargo. As modern experiments demonstrated, leaking alcohol vapor could create a sudden flash of pressure inside an enclosed hold. Remarkably, such an event might produce a loud blast without leaving lasting burn marks or widespread fire damage. Imagine hearing an unexpected explosion beneath your feet while carrying highly flammable cargo hundreds of miles from land. Captain Briggs could not have known whether another, much larger explosion might follow, opening the hatches, ventilating the cargo, temporarily leaving the vessel while conditions stabilized. Such decisions might have appeared entirely reasonable. Again, the evidence neither proves nor disproves this theory. It simply fits many of the known facts better than some earlier suggestions. Other explanations became far more imaginative. Some claimed a giant sea monster attacked the ship. Others blamed enormous octopuses capable of dragging sailors overboard. Still others imagined waterspouts, rogue waves, earthquakes beneath the sea, or strange magnetic forces. As the 20th century progressed, even more extraordinary ideas appeared. Visitors from another world, the lost civilization of Atlantis, the mysterious region known as the Bermuda Triangle. Curiously, the Mary Celeste never sailed anywhere near the Bermuda Triangle. Yet her story became connected with it anyway, because both involved unexplained disappearances. Such combinations reveal how legends often grow. Separate mysteries gradually become woven together until the boundaries between them disappear. For historians, these imaginative stories present an interesting challenge. They remind us how easily fiction can reshape memory. Each generation adds new interpretations reflecting its own interests. Victorian readers favored tales of mutiny and revenge. Mid-20th century audiences became fascinated by supernatural mysteries. Later generations explored scientific explanations involving chemistry and weather. The mystery itself remained unchanged. Only the questions evolved. Perhaps the most important lesson comes from returning to the original evidence. When modern researchers examine surviving documents, ship surveys, weather records, cargo manifests, and witness testimony, a remarkably ordinary picture emerges. The Mary Celeste was a well-built merchant vessel. Captain Briggs was respected and experienced. His crew appears competent. The weather had been challenging, but not extraordinary. The cargo contained industrial alcohol capable of producing unusual risks. The ship remained seaworthy after discovery. These facts may not produce a dramatic ending, but they deserve careful attention, precisely because they survived the passage of time. History often asks us to accept uncertainty. Sometimes, the most honest answer is simply that we do not know, not because people failed to investigate, not because evidence was ignored, but because the crucial moments unfolded far beyond the sight of any witness. The Atlantic is vast. Wind erases tracks. Rain washes away clues. The sea keeps very few records. Perhaps Captain Briggs made the best decision he could using the information available during those final hours. Perhaps circumstances changed only moments later. History cannot tell us. It offers only fragments. A final logbook entry, an abandoned ship, a missing lifeboat, a handful of empty barrels, and a mystery that continues to invite thoughtful discussion rather than certain answers. More than 150 years have now passed since the Mary Celeste drifted quietly into history. Yet she continues reminding us that the greatest mysteries are not always the ones filled with monsters or miracles. Sometimes, they are simply the quiet moments when ordinary people make difficult decisions, far from land, far from witnesses, leaving behind only silence and questions carried forever upon the wind. After months of investigation, the legal questions surrounding the Mary Celeste gradually came to an end. The ship herself, however, still had a future. Unlike so many vessels lost beneath the sea, she had survived. Her timbers remained sound. Her masts could still carry sail. Once repairs were completed and the official inquiry concluded, the brigantine returned to the work she had always known. She became, once again, a merchant ship. There is something quietly remarkable about that fact. Today we often remember the Mary Celeste only as a mystery. Yet for those living in the 1870s, she remained a practical vessel with cargo to carry and ports to visit. Ships were valuable investments. Owners could not simply retire a seaworthy vessel because unusual events had occurred aboard. The Atlantic trade continued. Goods still needed transporting. Crews still signed contracts. Life moved forward. In the years following the disappearance of Captain Benjamin Briggs and his family, new captains stood upon the same quarterdeck. New sailors climbed the familiar rigging. Fresh cargo filled the hold, where barrels of industrial alcohol had once rested. To these later crews, the ship likely inspired mixed emotions. Some probably regarded her with quiet curiosity. Others may have repeated stories heard in distant taverns or busy harbors. Sailors have always exchanged tales while waiting for favorable winds. The Mary Celeste soon became one of those stories. Imagine arriving in Liverpool, or Boston, or Genoa, and hearing someone mention that you now served aboard the famous abandoned brigantine. Every port seemed to know her name. Some listeners reacted with fascination. Others smiled politely. A few perhaps crossed themselves or offered a quiet prayer. The sea has always encouraged superstition. Long before scientific weather forecasting, sailors searched for meaning in unusual events. Certain birds became symbols. Certain winds carried reputations. Some ships themselves acquired legends. The Mary Celeste gradually joined that long tradition. Yet despite growing rumors, she continued sailing. Year after year, voyage after voyage, cargo replaced cargo, crew replaced crew. The Atlantic remained unchanged. Meanwhile, the families left behind continued living with unanswered loss. Benjamin Briggs's young son Arthur had remained safely ashore when the voyage began. His parents believed the journey would be too demanding for such a young child. That difficult decision, made with loving intentions, ultimately saved his life. One can only imagine how deeply the disappearance shaped his future. He grew up without his parents, without his little sister, without ever learning exactly what had happened to them. For Sarah Briggs's relatives, the mystery offered no true farewell. There was no confirmed place where their loved ones had spent their final moments. No recovered belongings explaining the last hours. No final letter, only silence. The sea often leaves families carrying questions instead of answers. Even today, families of missing sailors sometimes describe uncertainty as one of the most difficult burdens to bear. Without clear endings, the mind naturally continues searching. Friends of Captain Briggs remembered him as a thoughtful and dependable man. Many found it difficult to believe he would abandon a sound vessel without overwhelming reason. That reputation endured long after his disappearance. Historians who later studied his life generally reached similar conclusions. Nothing in his character suggested recklessness. If he ordered everyone into the lifeboat, he almost certainly believed he was protecting those under his care. Whether that decision proved tragically mistaken can never be known. As the years passed, ownership of the Mary Celeste changed hands several times. This was common for merchant ships. Commercial fortunes rose and fell. Investors bought and sold vessels according to changing markets. The brigantine visited familiar ports across the Atlantic, quietly performing the same work expected of hundreds of other merchant ships. Yet she never entirely escaped her reputation. Newspaper reporters occasionally mentioned her unusual history whenever she entered harbor. Travelers recognized her name. Curious visitors sometimes asked to see the famous vessel. It must have felt strange for ordinary sailors to realize they worked aboard a ship already becoming part of maritime legend. By the early 1880s, however, the Mary Celeste had begun showing her age. Years of exposure to salt water, storms, and constant service gradually weakened even well-built ships. Wood required continual maintenance. Rigging demanded replacement. Sails wore out. Merchant vessels rarely enjoyed easy lives. Every crossing left its mark. Eventually, new owners sought one final opportunity to profit from the aging brigantine. In 1885, Captain Gilman C. Parker took command of the Mary Celeste. Unlike Benjamin Briggs, Parker's reputation would become closely associated with controversy. Later investigations concluded that he and several associates deliberately attempted to commit insurance fraud. The plan involved loading the vessel with cargo that appeared valuable but was in reality worth far less than claimed. The intention seems to have been simple: sail the ship onto a reef, declare her a total loss, collect a generous insurance payment. If true, it represented a remarkably ordinary crime compared with the mysterious reputation already surrounding the vessel. Ironically, the Mary Celeste's final voyage contained no supernatural disappearance, no unexplained vanishing, no ghostly encounter. Instead, it ended because of human greed. Off the coast of Haiti, Captain Parker deliberately ran the brigantine onto Rocheleau Reef. The impact stranded the vessel beyond practical recovery. Unlike the events of 1872, witnesses existed this time. Authorities investigated. The insurance scheme gradually unraveled. Parker faced legal consequences, though he died before all proceedings concluded. The ship itself could not be saved. Wave after wave struck the stranded hull. Wood slowly broke apart beneath the relentless force of the Caribbean Sea. The Atlantic mystery had survived. The vessel had not. Within a relatively short time, little remained of the famous brigantine. Her timbers disappeared beneath the water. Nature quietly reclaimed what generations of shipbuilders had once carefully assembled. Today, the Mary Celeste no longer rests upon the surface of the sea, yet her absence has, in some ways, made her even more enduring. Thousands of merchant ships crossed the Atlantic during the 19th century. Most completed their work faithfully before fading into history. Very few remain remembered by name. The Mary Celeste became different, not because she was the largest, not because she carried the most valuable cargo, not because she fought great battles. She became unforgettable because one ordinary voyage ended with questions no one could answer, even after the ship herself disappeared beneath Caribbean waters. Her story continued traveling farther than any sail could ever carry her. Books preserved it, newspapers repeated it, families shared it, historians debated it, and generation after generation found themselves returning to the same quiet image, a brigantine drifting peacefully across the Atlantic, her sails still filled with wind, her cargo still resting below deck, but her captain, his family, and every member of the crew gone. As the decades quietly passed, the Mary Celeste drifted farther and farther away from the world of living memory. The sailors who had known Captain Benjamin Briggs grew older. The investigators in Gibraltar passed from the scene. The ports that had once welcomed tall sailing ships gradually filled with vessels powered by steam instead of wind. The 19th century gave way to the 20th, yet the mystery remained. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with time. This is one of history's curious habits. Many events become less interesting as years pass because new discoveries answer old questions. The story of the Mary Celeste followed the opposite path because no final answer ever appeared. Each generation found fresh reasons to revisit the abandoned brigantine. Authors wrote books. Journalists revisited the evidence. Maritime historians searched forgotten archives. Scientists conducted new experiments. Each hoped to discover the missing piece that earlier investigators had overlooked. Sometimes they uncovered valuable details. Old shipping records revealed information about the cargo. Family letters offered deeper insight into Captain Briggs's character. Weather reports helped reconstruct conditions across the Atlantic during those final days. Researchers carefully compared witness testimony with official documents. Slowly, the historical picture became clearer. Oddly enough, the mystery itself did not. Instead, historians became increasingly confident about what probably did not happen. There was little evidence supporting piracy, almost none supporting mutiny, no convincing signs of murder, no proof of sea monsters, ghost ships, or supernatural curses. The more carefully scholars examined surviving records, the more ordinary the facts appeared. And yet, the disappearance itself remained extraordinary. Popular culture often preferred more dramatic explanations. Ghost stories became especially common. Some claimed mysterious figures could still be seen walking the deserted deck. Others imagined phantom lights glowing from cabin windows on foggy nights. A few insisted that anyone sailing near the ship experienced strange voices carried upon the wind. These stories spread rapidly. Ghost stories always have. They ask very little of the listener, only imagination. Yet they tell us more about the people creating the legends than about the ship itself. Human beings have always searched for ways to explain what cannot easily be understood. Long before scientific investigation, mysterious events were often attributed to spirits, curses, or divine intervention. The Mary Celeste became another canvas upon which imagination painted its own answers. Cinema added another layer. Throughout the 20th century, films and television programs repeatedly retold the mystery. Some attempted careful historical reconstruction. Others embraced adventure and suspense. Screenwriters introduced dramatic confrontations that never occurred. Hidden treasure appeared where official records described ordinary cargo. Secret passengers emerged from nowhere. Storms grew larger. Villains became more sinister. Every adaptation reflected the tastes of its own era. Audiences, understandably, loved these stories. The quiet reality of merchant life rarely fills a cinema, but mysteries certainly do. Even classrooms occasionally discuss the Mary Celeste. Teachers found the story useful because it encouraged careful thinking. Students compared evidence. They evaluated competing theories. They learned an important lesson about historical research. Evidence and certainty are not always the same thing. Sometimes historians possess abundant documents, yet still cannot explain every event. Sometimes the most responsible answer remains, we do not know, far from representing failure. Such honesty forms one of history's greatest strengths. It reminds us not to confuse confidence with proof. Meanwhile, advances in marine archaeology transformed our understanding of countless historical shipwrecks. Scientists developed sonar, remote-operated vehicles, deep-sea photography. Entire vessels, once believed permanently lost, could now be studied beneath the ocean. Naturally, some people wondered whether similar discoveries might someday solve the mystery of the Mary Celeste. Unfortunately, the most important evidence was never the ship herself. It was the missing lifeboat. If Captain Briggs and the others left aboard that small craft, the Atlantic almost certainly reclaimed it long ago. Wood decays, canvas disappears, currents scatter fragile objects across enormous distances. The ocean keeps very few permanent records. Even modern technology cannot recover what no longer exists. That realization has gradually shifted the conversation. Today, many historians no longer search for one dramatic explanation. Instead, they consider combinations of smaller events, perhaps rough weather combined with concerns about the cargo, perhaps faulty pump readings increased anxiety, perhaps the temporary use of the lifeboat ended in tragedy after an unexpected squall. No single event may explain everything. Instead, several ordinary problems may have joined together at exactly the wrong moment. History often works that way. Great disasters sometimes emerge not from one enormous mistake, but from several small difficulties arriving together. This perspective also restores something important to the story. It reminds us that the people aboard were experienced professionals. For many years, popular retellings portrayed Captain Briggs as somehow careless or irrational. Modern scholarship paints a different picture. He appears thoughtful, methodical, deeply committed to his family and his responsibilities. The crew likewise seemed capable and experienced. Viewing them through this lens changes the mystery. Instead of asking, why did they make such a foolish decision? Many historians now ask, what circumstances would have convinced sensible people that leaving the ship offered the safest choice? That question feels both gentler and more realistic. It recognizes that decisions made during emergencies cannot be judged using information available only afterward. Perhaps that is why the Mary Celeste continues to resonate today. The mystery is not simply about an abandoned ship. It is about uncertainty, about making difficult choices when complete knowledge is impossible. Every generation understands that feeling, whether at sea or on land. Human beings often move forward without knowing exactly what lies ahead. The Mary Celeste reminds us that history is filled with such moments. Most simply pass unnoticed. A few become unforgettable. Now, more than 150 years after the brigantine sailed from New York Harbor, her name still appears in books, documentaries, museums, and conversations around the world. Children encounter the story for the first time. Researchers continue examining familiar evidence with fresh eyes. Readers pause over the same unanswered questions that puzzled investigators in Gibraltar so many years ago. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Mary Celeste. Not fear, not superstition, not ghosts drifting across moonlit waves, but curiosity. A quiet invitation to observe carefully, to think patiently, and to accept that some chapters of history end not with certainty, but with respectful wonder. As the Atlantic continues rolling beneath changing skies, just as it did in the winter of 1872, the winds no longer carry the sails of the Mary Celeste. Her timbers have long since disappeared. Her crew never returned. Yet her story continues its voyage, crossing oceans of memory instead of water, reminding us that even the deepest mysteries often begin with something as ordinary as a ship setting sail beneath a peaceful morning sky. And now, as our journey with the Mary Celeste slowly comes to its close, the Atlantic grows quiet once more. Imagine standing upon the deck of a wooden sailing ship just after sunset. The day's work has ended. The sails rise gently overhead. The wind has softened into a steady whisper. Far away, the horizon has disappeared into darkness, leaving only the faint line where sea and sky become one. Above, countless stars fill the heavens. Below, the ocean reflects them like scattered silver. The ship moves almost silently through the water. There is no hurry, no destination demanding immediate arrival, only the endless rhythm of waves carrying the vessel forward. Perhaps this is the image that best suits the story of the Mary Celeste, not the frightening image often found in popular imagination, not a haunted ship drifting beneath storm clouds, but a quiet merchant vessel crossing an immense ocean, carrying ordinary people whose lives became part of an extraordinary mystery. History often celebrates kings, generals, and famous inventors, yet many of its most meaningful stories belong to ordinary men and women. Captain Benjamin Briggs was not seeking fame. He simply hoped to deliver his cargo safely to Genoa. Sarah Briggs was not embarking upon an adventure for history books. She was traveling beside her husband, caring for their young daughter just as countless mothers have always done. The sailors who signed aboard the Mary Celeste expected another working voyage, nothing more. They rose before dawn, adjusted sails, maintained ropes, cooked meals, worked the pumps, recorded the weather. They performed thousands of small tasks that kept ships crossing oceans during the age of sail. These quiet routines rarely appear in history books, yet they built the world we know today. Before aircraft crossed continents, before container ships carried millions of tons of cargo, before radio connected vessels across the sea, people like the crew of the Mary Celeste linked distant nations through patience, skill, and determination. Every barrel loaded onto a dock, every letter carried across the Atlantic, every voyage completed safely, helped shape an increasingly connected world. Perhaps that is why this story continues to feel so human. Its mystery invites curiosity, its ordinary beginnings inspire familiarity, and its uncertain ending reminds us that history does not always provide neat conclusions. Sometimes, the evidence simply runs out. There is a certain humility in accepting that truth. Modern technology has answered countless questions our ancestors could never solve. We have mapped distant planets, explored the deepest oceans, decoded ancient languages. Yet even today, one abandoned sailing ship from 1872 still asks a question that no one can answer with complete confidence. Rather than diminishing history, that uncertainty enriches it. It reminds us that the past remains a place of discovery. Every old journal, every weather report, every family letter tucked inside an archive may still offer new understanding. Perhaps one day another forgotten document will emerge. Perhaps some overlooked clue still waits quietly inside a museum collection or maritime archive. Or perhaps the final answer truly disappeared with the Atlantic waves on that distant December day. If so, that too is part of history. Nature has always possessed the final word more often than we realize. The sea gives generously. It carries travelers across continents, provides food, creates trade, inspires exploration, but it also keeps its own counsel. For thousands of years, sailors have understood this quiet truth. The ocean remembers everything, yet explains very little. As you think back over the story, it is worth remembering how remarkably calm much of it truly was. There were no great naval battles, no treasure maps, no heroic rescues. Instead, there were patient routines, careful navigation, simple meals, changing weather, a family traveling together, a hard-working crew doing their jobs with quiet professionalism. Even the mystery itself may have emerged not from one dramatic event, but from several ordinary circumstances meeting at precisely the wrong moment. Life often unfolds that way. The smallest decisions can carry the greatest consequences. Captain Briggs likely believed he was making the safest choice available. Whether history ever confirms that thought hardly changes the respect many historians continue to hold for him. Judging people of the past requires compassion as well as evidence. They could not see the future. They could only respond to the moment before them, just as we all do. The Mary Celeste has now sailed through more than a century and a half of memory. She has appeared in novels, documentaries, museums, classrooms, conversations between historians, and perhaps tonight, she has quietly sailed into your own imagination as well, not simply as an unsolved puzzle, but as a glimpse into a slower world shaped by wind, wood, stars, and remarkable patience. If you ever find yourself standing beside the sea, perhaps on a quiet beach at sunset, or watching waves roll steadily toward the shore, you might remember that somewhere beyond the horizon lie the routes once followed by thousands of sailing ships. Most completed their journeys and were forgotten. One became unforgettable, not because of what historians know, but because of what they never could. And perhaps there is something peaceful about leaving the story there, without forcing certainty where none exists, without inventing answers simply because unanswered questions feel uncomfortable. Sometimes the wisest ending is also the quietest. To simply acknowledge that a family, a crew, and a faithful little brigantine crossed the Atlantic together, that the ship returned, and that the people did not. Their final hours remain hidden beyond the reach of every investigation, yet their memory endures. Not through fear, but through curiosity. Not through sensational stories, but through the enduring human desire to understand those who came before us. As the lantern aboard our imagined ship grows dimmer, the stars continue their silent journey overhead. The waves keep their steady rhythm. The wind carries one final whisper through the rigging. The Atlantic stretches peacefully into the darkness, just as it did on that distant winter evening in 1872. Thank you for spending this quiet voyage with Whispered History. May the gentle rhythm of the sea stay with you. May the unanswered mysteries of the past inspire peaceful curiosity rather than worry. And may your own evening now drift as calmly as a ship beneath a sky full of stars. Good night.